When someone hurts you, especially someone close, someone you've emotionally invested in, your first instinct is often to react. It's primal, it's immediate, and it's usually emotional. You cry, you lash out, you demand answers, you want them to see what they've done, to feel guilty, to fix it. But let's stop and examine that for a moment. What does that emotional reaction actually accomplish? In most cases, especially with someone who's used to having emotional power over you, it reinforces their control. Your reaction, your visible pain, validates their influence. And in some unfortunate cases, it even rewards them. Here's the truth. Pain can be a weapon in the hands of the wrong person. Not necessarily because they're evil, but because they're human. And humans are deeply responsive to power dynamics. When you show how much they've shaken you, you communicate that they still hold power over your inner world. That's a dangerous position to be in, because now they know they can hurt you. And if they're immature, narcissistic, or emotionally underdeveloped, they'll interpret that as leverage. You want to confuse him? Respond, don't react. That's where your power begins. Responding means you engage with intention. It means you allow yourself space to process, to reflect, to breathe. When he says something cruel or acts with disregard, don't immediately explode, cry, or try to argue him back into compassion. Instead, pause. Maintain your composure. That silence is not weakness, it's psychological depth. It signals strength and control. You're not denying your pain, you're channeling it. And most importantly, you're refusing to let it dictate your behavior. See, in psychology, there's this idea of emotional regulation. It's the ability to experience an emotion without becoming it. People who can regulate their emotions effectively are less likely to be manipulated. They confuse those who expect a predictable, chaotic response. A man who has learned to push your buttons will feel unsettled when those buttons stop producing the same reaction. That's because he no longer understands the game he's playing. You've changed the rules. Now, let's take this a step further, philosophically. In Stoic thought, which is something I think we would do well to revisit in modern relationship, there's an understanding that we cannot control other people, only ourselves. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength." The moment you stop trying to force someone to understand you, to feel your pain, to make things right, you begin reclaiming your sovereignty, your emotional independence. That kind of detachment isn't coldness, it's maturity. It's knowing the difference between connection and dependency. And it's exactly what confuses someone who expects their behavior to determine your emotional climate. Imagine this. He does something hurtful, maybe even expects drama, but instead you're calm, not distant, not fake, just centered. You carry yourself with clarity and poise. That subtle shift is profoundly unsettling to someone who's used to being in control. Why? Because it signals that you're no longer reacting to him. You're responding from within yourself. He's no longer the reference point for your behavior. You are. And here's what's fascinating. That confusion often leads to curiosity. He might try to regain the old dynamic. He may push harder. But if you stay grounded, detached, intentional, that confusion deepens into respect, or at the very least, discomfort. Either way, you've broken the cycle. And that's how change begins. So don't give him the reaction he expects. Give him the version of you that he can't predict. Calm, collected, self-contained. And that's not just confusing, that's powerful. When we talk about pulling away from someone who's hurt you, most people think in terms of physical distance. Stop texting, stop showing up, maybe block them for good measure. And yes, that has its place. But physical withdrawal on its own is often not enough, because what truly ties you to someone isn't your body, it's your energy, your attention, your thoughts, the internal dialogue you have with yourself about them. That's the real battlefield. And that's what you need to reclaim. Let's get clear on something. People feel your energy even when you're silent. They sense when you're still orbiting them emotionally, even if you're pretending to have moved on. It's a subtle but powerful signal. You can be sitting alone in your room miles away and still feeding them your energy through rumination, through fantasy, through grief. And if that person has any emotional awareness at all, they feel it. They might not be able to name it, but they sense that they still occupy real estate in your mind, and that gives them power. Now consider what happens when you shift that energy inward, when you stop obsessing, stop explaining, stop waiting for them to get it. You're no longer offering your psychic presence as a resource. That creates a vacuum, and vacuums disturb people, especially those who've grown used to your emotional availability. He will feel the drop-off in ways you may not even expect, and it won't make sense to him. That's what confuses him. Psychologically, this comes down to the concept of reinforcement. In behavioral theory, we know that attention, whether positive or negative, is reinforcement. If he hurts you and you keep showing emotional engagement, even through confrontation, you're reinforcing his sense of significance in your world. You're teaching him that no matter what he does, he still gets fed. But the moment you go still, not bitter, not angry, just still, he loses the feedback loop. He starts questioning, he becomes destabilized. But this isn't just a tactic, it's a transformation. Because when you withdraw your energy, something remarkable happens. You start to see things clearly. You start to feel the weight of what you've been giving away, your peace, your focus, your dignity. And as that returns to you, piece by piece, your center strengthens. You no longer need his validation or apology to feel whole. You become less reactive, less desperate for closure. That's not emotional coldness, that's psychological sovereignty. In many philosophical traditions, particularly in Eastern thought, detachment is seen not as indifference, but as freedom. It's the ability to engage without clinging, to love without losing yourself. When you withdraw your energy from someone who's misused it, you're not being cruel, you're restoring balance. You're recognizing that connection without mutual care is not connection at all. It's servitude. And I'll tell you something else. Withdrawing your energy doesn't go unnoticed. It's the loudest silence he'll ever hear, because he expected you to keep reaching out, to keep explaining, to keep needing something from him. When you stop, truly stop, it triggers something ancient in the human psyche. The fear of irrelevance, the fear of losing access to what once was certain. You don't have to say a word. Your absence says everything. So stop chasing explanations. Stop pouring your energy into a well that only echoes your voice back at you. That energy is your life force. Reclaim it, guard it, redirect it into the parts of you that were starving while you were feeding someone who was never hungry for your truth. There's something deeply disarming about confidence, especially when it shows up in the aftermath of pain, when someone expects to find you broken, apologetic, clinging for scraps of attention, and instead finds you walking taller, speaking clearer, smiling with sincerity. That doesn't just confuse them, it confronts them. It challenges the entire narrative they had about you, about your worth, and about their role in your story. See, when someone hurts you, they often assume they've knocked you off center. In fact, many times, whether consciously or unconsciously, that's the point. It's a form of psychological dominance. They test how far they can push, how much of your dignity they can chip away before you collapse into neediness or rage. When you don't do that, when you respond not with despair, but with elevation, you overturn their sense of control. And that shift in dynamic is profound. Now, this isn't about pretending. It's not about faking confidence or slapping on a smile while you're falling apart inside. That's performative and people see through it. What I'm talking about is real, earned confidence. The kind that comes not from revenge, but from clarity. Clarity about who you are, what you deserve, and what you will no longer tolerate. You know, from a psychological perspective, there's something called self-affirmation theory. It tells us that when our sense of identity is threatened, say through rejection or betrayal, we can restore our psychological equilibrium by reinforcing core values. In other words, when someone tries to define your worth downward, the antidote is to rise upward in alignment with your true self. You don't shrink to meet their perception, you expand to match your own potential. This is where things get interesting. Because when you begin to invest in your appearance, your goals, your physical and intellectual well-being, not as a means to provoke jealousy or stir attention, but as a declaration of self-respect, you begin to radiate something people can't quite explain. That glow people talk about, it's real. It's not just aesthetic. It's psychological. It's the byproduct of alignment. You are no longer orbiting around someone else's validation. You are standing in your own gravity. And what's crucial here is the unpredictability of this transformation. Most people expect predictable outcomes from emotional injury, tears, neediness, regression. But when your pain becomes the fuel for a deeper evolution, that's disorienting. It confronts them with their misjudgment. It forces them to reevaluate what you brought to the table and what they've lost access to. There's a certain philosophical elegance to this too. Nietzsche once said, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." When you reclaim your why, your purpose, your values, your identity, you become resilient. You're no longer reacting to someone else's chaos. You're creating order within yourself. And that order is magnetic, not because it seeks to attract, but because it's complete in itself. So let him see you smiling, not for him, but despite him. Let him witness your progress, your glow, your inner peace, and let him wonder why you didn't fall apart. Let that be his burden to carry. Because the truth is, the most powerful response to being underestimated, to being hurt or discarded, is not retaliation, it's reinvention. Not for show, but for survival and then for thriving. There's a strange paradox in human behavior, especially in relationships. People often listen less to what you say and more to how you move. And I don't just mean physically. I mean the decisions you make, the boundaries you enforce, the direction of your attention. These things speak louder than words ever could. And when someone has hurt you, particularly someone who assumed you'd stay the same, the most disorienting thing you can do is stop explaining and start acting differently. Now, most people think communication is verbal, that if they just say the right thing, if they can find the perfect phrase or text or emotional plea, they can make someone understand, feel guilty, wake up, change. But this is rarely true, because once someone has emotionally distanced themselves, they stop listening in the way you hope. They're not hearing your pain, they're observing your weakness. And that's harsh, but it's real. In moments of conflict, words often become noise, but behavior, especially change behavior, is clarity. There's a psychological principle at play here, operant conditioning. If someone mistreats you and your response is to engage, argue, or plead, you're reinforcing a loop. They learn, whether they realize it or not, that bad behavior still earns your presence. But if your response is withdrawal, indifference, or a meaningful shift in behavior, you disrupt that loop. You send a different message. What you did matters, but not in the way you hoped. You are not inviting further dialogue. You are demonstrating consequence without drama. But this is where silence becomes so powerful, not passive silence, the kind that masks resentment but still yearns for connection. I'm talking about intentional silence, a deliberate choice to say less while letting your actions speak more. Because the truth is, people feel absence. They notice when access is reduced. And when you stop justifying, stop defending, stop hoping they'll see your side, they're forced to sit with their own. And that's where discomfort begins to grow. Philosophically, this ties into the idea of logos, of reasoned speech. In ancient Greek thought, logos wasn't just about words, it was about meaningful action aligned with higher order. When your words no longer serve that order, when they fall on deaf ears, then the wise thing to do is to embody your truth rather than argue it. The more aligned your behavior is with your self-respect, the less you need to talk. And here's something else worth noting. When you stop broadcasting your feelings, you become harder to read, and people fear what they can't predict. Predictability gives them comfort, control. But when your patterns shift, when you stop reacting the way you used to, it unsettles them. They start to wonder what changed. What do they miss? Why aren't you reaching out, explaining, begging? That silence becomes a mirror, forcing them to see themselves without your narrative softening the edges. It's also a test of their character, of their willingness to reflect. Will they step up or slip further into denial? You'll find out not through what they say, but through how they respond to your shift. If they blame your silence, mock your distance, or try to provoke you back into old patterns, you'll know they weren't interested in growth, just in dominance. But if they begin to confront themselves, if they reach out, not with manipulation, but with humility, then perhaps there's space for something real. But either way, your job isn't to educate someone into treating you right. It's to carry yourself in a way that makes mistreatment unsustainable. That's power, not because it controls them, but because it liberates you. One of the most profound shifts you can make after someone hurts you is to stop seeing yourself as powerless. That's a difficult thing to do because emotional pain, especially when it comes from someone you trusted, can make you feel small, reactive, and disoriented. And if you're not careful, you start organizing your behavior around their approval, their apologies, their attention. But here's the truth. The longer you wait for someone else to make it right, the longer you postpone your own liberation. What you have to do is redefine the power dynamic. And I don't mean by overpowering them or winning in some childish psychological game. I mean by shifting the entire frame of reference. Stop looking at them as the source of your healing, your validation, or your closure. The moment you stop needing anything from the person who hurt you, especially the need to understand why, you begin to untangle yourself from their grip. And that's what regaining power really looks like. Let's look at this psychologically. In attachment theory, we know that insecure bonds often lead us to tolerate things that are beneath us. Why? Because the fear of abandonment outweighs the discomfort of mistreatment. We become loyal to pain because at least pain is familiar. But the moment you start to prioritize your dignity over your desire to stay connected, that's when the equation flips. And that's where confusion begins for the person who thought they could hurt you without consequence. See, many people operate within unspoken hierarchies in relationships. They test boundaries consciously or not to see where they stand. If they can hurt you and still have access to you, they learn that your loyalty is unconditional. But when you withdraw, not just physically, but spiritually, emotionally, energetically, they're forced to face a new reality. The rules have changed. They're no longer at the top of the hierarchy in your life. Your self-respect is. Philosophically, this speaks to the concept of self-possession. In Stoic thought and even in many religious traditions, power begins not in domination over others, but in mastery over oneself. The ability to suffer without losing your moral center. To respond to betrayal not by sinking, but by rising. Calmly, deliberately, without theatricality. That is what true strength looks like. Not the loud, vindictive kind, the quiet kind. The kind that doesn't need to prove anything. The kind that is rooted in truth. And here's what happens. When you no longer tolerate mistreatment, not with anger, but with distance, it becomes clear that you are no longer playing the same game. You've moved to a different playing field altogether. That's deeply unsettling to someone who expected you to stay in the emotional role they cast you in. The caretaker, the forgiver, the one who absorbs damage and keeps giving. But when that script no longer works, they're left scrambling to find a new way to engage with you. Sometimes they'll lash out. Sometimes they'll suddenly become kind again as a way to lure you back into the old pattern. That's not change. That's strategy. You'll know it's real when they respect the new standard you set without trying to negotiate their way around it. And if they can't do that, then you've gained something far more valuable than their attention: clarity. Because the reality is, not everyone deserves access to you. Love does not require submission. Forgiveness does not require reunion. You can choose to release someone without needing them to understand what they lost. That's not cruelty, it's maturity. What most people fail to realize is that healing, real healing, isn't passive. It's not something that just happens with time. Time by itself doesn't change anything. It's what you do with that time that matters. If you spend it ruminating, obsessing, replaying conversations, stalking social media profiles, you're not healing, you're rehearsing your pain, you're feeding it, and the pain begins to define you. But if you make the decision to grow in the space where the wound was created, everything changes. When someone hurts you, especially someone you let close, it feels personal. It feels like a direct assault on your worth. And it's tempting to let that pain sculpt your identity, to wear it like armor, to become cynical, guarded, small. But that's not recovery. That's adaptation to injury. And it keeps you tethered to the very person who caused the damage. True healing is the opposite. It's not becoming less of who you are. It's becoming more. It's expanding beyond the damage. This requires a conscious shift in narrative. You have to stop asking, why did he do this to me? And start asking, what do I do with this now? That shift takes you out of victimhood and into authorship. It's not about blame anymore. It's about responsibility. Not for what happened, but for what happens next. Psychologically, this touches on the concept of post-traumatic growth. Research shows that people who go through significant emotional suffering don't just bounce back, they often grow in remarkable ways. They become more self-awareness, more spiritually grounded, more focused on what truly matters. But that kind of growth is not automatic. It's intentional, it's uncomfortable, and it requires you to stop waiting for an apology and start building a new foundation without it. You have to build a life so rich, so meaningful, that their absence becomes irrelevant. Not because you've denied your pain, but because you've transcended it. That's not pretending you're okay when you're not. It's doing the real work, digging into your patterns, your boundaries, your habits, asking yourself hard questions. What part of me tolerated this? What did I ignore in the name of love? What standard did I abandon for the illusion of connection? And then you rebuild, brick by brick. You cultivate interests that have nothing to do with them. You reclaim your time, your space, your body. You start choosing relationships based on mutual respect, not chemistry alone. You begin to walk differently, speak differently, carry yourself like someone who finally remembered their own value. And the people around you feel that shift. They either rise to meet it or they fall away. Now, here's the part that really confuses the person who hurt you. It's not just that you moved on, it's how you did it. Without bitterness, without spectacle, without the need to prove anything, you simply evolved. And nothing is more unsettling to someone who expected your world to stop spinning without them than to watch it spin even brighter without their presence. In philosophical terms, this is the essence of individuation, as Carl Jung described it. The process of becoming whole, of integrating your wounds, not by hiding them, but by transforming them into wisdom. That's what healing really is. Not erasure of the past, but mastery over its meaning. So don't aim to return to who you were before the hurt. That version of you was vulnerable to it. Instead, become the person you needed when you were at your lowest. Let that be your closure. Let your growth be the punctuation mark at the end of the sentence they wrote with their betrayal.